So thanks everyone for joining the 5th session of the Oxford Karl Popper Society Remote Reading Group. Today our guest speaker is Professor Dorian Bandy of McGill University. Dorian is both a musical performer, having performed in institutions such as London's Wigmore and Amsterdam's Concertgebouw, which as a Dutch person I thought was very cool. And Dorian is also a music researcher, having written on meme theory, musical meaning, and the philosophy of historical performance. And I think it's in these writings that Dorian draws upon the work of Karl Popper. So today, Dorian will be giving a webinar about 2 scenes from Mozart, specifically his operas, the Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. And then he'll discuss notions of explanation, causation, and reality as they might apply to our understanding of these artworks. Having said that, I will hand over the talk to Dorian. Dorian, please go ahead. Thanks very much for joining us.
Great. Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And I think that I'll just start by saying that, as many of you know, I have spent a long time, at least 3 or 4 years, ranting at my musicologist colleagues about Popper and making them listen to me talk about epistemology. And I thought when you extended this invitation to me, I thought it was only fair that I should now bring some Mozart to people interested in Popper and reverse things a bit. So yes, I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And my plan actually, we'll have to see how the timing goes. I'm still new to doing lectures like this on Zoom, so we'll play it by ear a bit. But my plan is actually to talk about not just 2, but maybe, if we have time, 4 scenes from Mozart's operas. And then after that, as I say, I'll tie them in a bit to more explicitly Popperian issues, and then we can open up for discussion. When I do talk about the Mozart, I will try, at least at first, to make it slightly more discussion-based than just a lecture. So even though I will mostly be talking about this music, I'll also welcome any interruptions. I'm very interruptible. I'll welcome interruptions. I will welcome comments. I might ask a few rhetorical questions, which you are always welcome to answer. So please, everybody, feel free to chime in. And if that doesn't work in the first few scenes we talk about, then we can I can be a little bit more lecture-like as we go on.
Yes.
Okay. So having said that, let me now try to share my stuff with you. And Sam, it says that the host has disabled screen sharing.
I will enable it now.
Great.
It should be enabled as of now.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I have a little title slide for you. Can you all see the little title slide? Are operatic characters real? This is my provocative title for the discussion today. And spoiler alert, the answer just might be that yes, they are. But we'll get to that at the end. And I'm going to just jump right in and take us to the opening scene from Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro. This is his first collaboration with the poet Lorenzo da Ponte. They wrote 3 operas together, and my plan today is to talk about 1 or 2 scenes from each of their 3 collaborations. These 3 operas are widely considered to be among the high points of 18th century opera. It's generally thought that da Ponte provided Mozart with better texts than he ever had the pleasure of working with in his other operatic works. And likewise, it's generally recognized that Mozart wrote better music for da Ponte than might otherwise be expected. That this, for whatever reason, this collaboration was seen really as a fruitful and wonderful collaboration. So let's go straight to the first number from The Marriage of Figaro. And I've given you the entire text on this slide. So let's just quickly read through this text, and then I'll turn on the music. The story here is that Figaro is measuring space in the room for his bed. So you see him at the beginning counting out 5, 10, 20, 30, 36. He's measuring where the bed will go. And Susanna, his bride-to-be, his fiancée, is trying on her cap that she has obtained for the wedding. So it starts out with Figaro doing his thing and Susanna doing her thing. And as you can see, this text is arranged in 3 stanzas. The first stanza starts out with Figaro talking, and then Susanna responds, or she doesn't respond, she does her thing, but we get 2 lines of Figaro, 2 lines of Susanna. The next stanza, da Ponte switches it, and we get 2 lines of Susanna, and then 2 lines of Figaro. And then the final stanza, Susanna and Figaro sing together. Now, before we listen to the music, what can we observe about these stanzas, and not just the arrangement of who speaks when, but what they're actually saying? In the first stanza, Figaro is doing his own thing and Susanna is doing her own thing. And then something happens. In the next stanza, Susanna says, "Look at my hat, Figaro." She makes contact. And so it's no longer just Figaro doing one thing and Susanna doing her own thing. Now, Susanna is speaking directly to Figaro. And Figaro responds, "Yes, my dear, it's very beautiful. It looks like it had been made just for you." And then the last stanza, they sing together and they're focused on the wedding day and, of course, the charming little hat. Now, this poetic structure where they're doing separate things and then they're kind of doing the same thing and then they're really doing the same thing, that's basically the trajectory. That poetic structure is something that Mozart has the task of working into the music. So having said all of that, we're now going to listen to the beginning of this music, and I'm going to hope that the technology works. Again, I've never done this before. Somebody stop me if you can't hear the music. The way it starts is just with the orchestra, and then a few minutes in, the singing starts. The whole number is only 2 minutes long, so I'm just going to play it from the beginning. Here we go. Okay, did that sound come across okay? Okay, excellent. So that's the opening duet. Now, something that you already noticed, which I probably should have mentioned beforehand for people who are not used to listening to opera and following the texts, is that Mozart is allowed to repeat words. So for example, you probably noticed that when Susanna first says, "Look at my hat," in the second stanza, Figaro is still in the background counting out inches or feet or whatever, I guess not feet, inches on the floor. This is important because it means that Mozart has some flexibility in how he actually sets the text. It's not just supposed to go line by line by line. He's allowed to go a little bit backwards, a little bit forwards. At one point, Susanna circles around and says, "How happy I am again," and this is at the end of the second stanza. So it's not simply a linear progression. But in any case, let's now dive into the music a bit and ask how the music amplifies or comments on what's going on in the text. Now, first of all, there's a very basic thing that's happening, which is that each character is associated with a different kind of musical style. So even before the singing starts, we're presented with two distinct melodies. We have the first one, which, going back to the beginning, sounds like this. That's the first melody. And then we have another one, which goes like this. And then that opening bit ends, and then the singing starts. Now, we might suspect, remember that this is the first number in the opera, and we as listeners don't necessarily know what's going to happen yet. Imagine being in the audience for the first time. You have no idea how the plot's going to unfold. You don't know who these people are. All you see are two people on stage, somebody measuring on the ground, somebody else trying on a hat. You hear that music, and you already might think that those melodies have something to do with the individual characters we're going to encounter in the scene. Now, Mozart has actually gone to some lengths to make that music as characteristic as possible. So the music isn't just giving us nice melodies, it's also telling us something interesting about these characters. For example, if we go back to the opening melody, this is the melody that will be associated with Figaro. What's the first thing we notice about it? Here's the melody one more time. What you might notice is that distinctive rhythm, bum, 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 bum. It's very march-like. The kind of character that gets a melody like that in this sort of opera is probably going to be a man, and probably going to be, I don't want to say too important a man, but still somebody with a sort of serious job who is doing serious things. Now, he happens to be measuring for a bed, but Figaro is also the valet to Count Almaviva. So he has a sort of important job. He handles a lot of affairs for the Count. And that march signifies quite a bit about the character that we're going to encounter. You'll also notice, just on a musical level, that the melody does not move with stepwise notes. We don't hear sort of gentle scalar melodies where you hear consecutive notes, dee, 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 notes next to each other. We hear just big leaps. Yum, ba-dum, bum, 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 dee, 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 just large leaps. Leaps up, leap down. You'll also notice that the melody is associated with a particular family of instruments. It's played by the violins with accompaniment in the strings. And there are a few very subtle, quiet wind chords going on in the background, but the winds aren't doing anything important for the melody itself. Now, there's even more that we can say about it, because even though it's a march and it has that yum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba, that very strict martial quality, it's also, there's something a little bit wrong with it. It's not quite a perfect march. And the first thing you might notice actually about this is that in the accompaniment, something feels a little bit off. The march has a big, strong beat, yum, ba-dum, bum, 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 beam, bum, bum, ba-dum. It's in 4, so we have strong beats every 4 beats, dum, ba, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And yet, normally when you encounter something like that in a march, you expect the entire orchestra to go along with where the strong beats are, and hence the people marching can march together more easily. But in this case, the bass section, the low notes at the bottom of the range, don't come in on the correct beat. They come in halfway through the bar on what should be a weak beat. Here it is one more time, and see if you can listen entirely down to the bottom of the music, and I'll just do something with my hand when the bass is entering. Listen for it, here we go. Again. So this is a march that isn't quite right. Something is a little bit wrong with it. It's well-meaning, but it's a bit messed up. And there's something else that Mozart is doing that breaks the normal symmetry of his musical language very often. And this might get a little technical, but I know that there are some musicians in the room, and I hope that you can follow me. There's a phenomenon in a lot of this music called antecedents and consequence. Phrases are built from roughly equal length building blocks. If you have a 4-bar phrase, the likelihood is that you will have 2-bar antecedent and 2-bar consequent. The two halves of the musical gesture will be roughly the same length. They'll be somewhat in balance with each other. Now, Figaro's little march figure is a bit weird because it has an antecedent, what should be just the first part of the melody, which lasts for most of the melody. Let's listen just to the antecedent. Still going. Still going. Still going. And finally, we have a consequent. And that's the whole consequent. This is extremely out of proportion. Mozart's audiences, who were used to hearing very square, even phrases, would have listened to that and would have thought that that was a massive breach of courtly decorum. Nobody who really knows how to behave in an upper-class court would sing that way, would have music that lasts with such a big antecedent and such a short response. So before Figaro has even opened his mouth, this is the main point, before he's even started to sing, we actually know quite a bit about this character. We have reason to believe that he is somewhat serious, but maybe a little bit bungling, that he means well, but he's not always going to manage to do the right thing all the time, that he sort of speaks the upper class language a little bit because he hangs out in court, so he knows how a march goes, kind of, but he also doesn't quite know how to get the march right every time. Again, notice that he hasn't even sung anything, and we already know these things about him. Now let's contrast this with the next melody that happens. Now again, before Susanna has even opened her mouth, we hear a melody where, unlike Figaro's, if you think back to Figaro with all those big leaps, dum ba dum bum 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 bum, Susanna's melody is all about moving in step. Yum dee 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 dee. It's all consecutive notes. It doesn't have any of those strong beats. It's much more lilting, much more flowing, and it's played by a different family of instruments. It's played by the wind instruments, and this time it's the violins that just do little interjections, just for a little humorous effect. So already, again, before the characters have even started to sing, we know something about them. We have this sense of Figaro as embodying one kind of musical world and Susanna as embodying a very different one. When they start to sing, our suspicions are borne out. We find out that we were correct. Indeed, Figaro is associated with the march-like melody and Susanna is not. Here's the opening with the singing. So that was Figaro, and now we get Susanna doing her gentle lilting melody with the winds. Now, at that point, we've wrapped up the first stanza, and we're on to the second stanza. And this is where things get interesting for the setting of the text. Mozart gives Susanna the main musical content here. She's going to say, look at my hat, Figaro, look at my hat. But you'll notice that while she says that, Figaro is still singing his measuring melody. He's still saying 5, 10, 20, 30. Now, this actually changes the flavor of how we think about the text, because you can imagine a version of the text, or not of the text could be the same, but you could imagine a version of this opera where the words have not changed. She's saying, look at my hat, and you could imagine that Figaro simply is looking at her hat, and the idea of look at the hat is not really an enjoinder. It's not really something that she has to ask him to do. It's simply they're talking about how they're looking at it and it's so nice. But by giving Figaro the same old counting melody, Mozart is adding a bit of urgency to these words. It's not just that Susanna is saying, oh, look, the hat's so nice. She's saying, please look, Figaro, please look, really, please look. And still saying it while Figaro ignores her. Now, when Figaro does finally look, something very interesting happens with the melodies. Figaro, this whole time, has been singing a single melody, right? The thing with the big leaps, the march-like thing where he counts. He finally looks, and what is the first thing you notice about the melody? He abandons his melody and sings a different one. I'm going to back up a tiny bit to the second stanza. Here we go. And here we go. Figaro is about to say, yes, it's so beautiful. And what melody does he sing? he sings Susanna's melody. Again, this is an indication from Mozart that Figaro is now occupying her musical world. He's stopped doing what he was doing before, he's let his melody go, and he's taking her melody and running with it. Now, they're gonna have a little back and forth. Susanna is gonna say how happy she is. This is going back to stanza 1 for her, and Figaro is going to just keep commenting on it. Yes, the hat is so nice. So he'll be singing from stanza 2, she'll be singing from stanza 1. This is just killing a bit of musical time. We need it for the musical form, but I'm not gonna go into that now. We'll just listen through it.
Sì, mio cuore, vorrei più bello. Ora sì, io son contento. Ora sì, io son contento. Sembra fatto il vero per te, per te, per te.
Now, before we go to the last stanza, there's one quick thing to say about the musical form of this number. Form just refers to the order in which themes are presented, how we move from the beginning of the number to the end of the number. And in general, what is considered important in this style of music is that you start in one key with one theme, you move to a different key, usually with the same old theme, but in the new key, and then you go back to the home key with the original theme. Now, we actually saw that happen. I didn't comment on this, but what happened when Figaro responded in Susanna's melody, he was actually doing that in the new key that we have moved to. And now the point of the music is to get us back to the original key so that the number can end where it started. Now, this is interesting. Normally when this happens in this style of music, the composer has to bring back the original melody that started the piece. It's called in technical jargon a recapitulation, where the theme from the beginning comes back in its home key. And this is very strange what Mozart does here. He brings back the original key, but he does not bring back the original melody. As soon as both characters are singing together about the wedding day, listen to which melody they choose. In other words, they choose Susanna's melody. So what's happened over the whole trajectory of this number is that Figaro has presented a tune while he was doing his measuring thing, and then Mozart and Figaro let that tune disappear. It doesn't come back ever again. We never hear it again. This doesn't usually happen in a classical operatic number. Usually the tunes get recycled, reused, developed, elaborated. In this case, Figaro's melody simply disappears. Now, what Mozart is giving us is a kind of musical imitation of what we see in the text. What we see in the text is the picture of a very happy and, I should say, soon to be very well married and successful couple. This is a couple that knows how to adapt to each other, where Figaro knows that when Susanna thinks something is important, he should leave off the measuring and do what she wants to do for a little while. And the text shows us that. The text gives us Figaro doing one thing and then Susanna doing another thing juxtaposed in one stanza. The next stanza, Susanna saying, "Look, Figaro," and Figaro looking. And then the final stanza, the two of them singing together. There's a move in the text from doing separate things to doing the same thing. And the music does that also. The music gives us two different melodies, which then become a single melody by the end. It's a way that Mozart's music amplifies the trajectory of the text, takes us on the same journey that Da Ponte's poetry is taking us on. It's showing us something also about the overall scope of the opera. If any of you know the rest of the opera, and I encourage you all to listen to it, it's a fantastic piece. If you know the rest of it, basically there are a lot of little machinations, subplots, a lot of drama in the opera, and Susanna always wins. She wins the opera, she is the smartest character, and everybody finds a way to conform to what she wants them to do. So this duet, the fact that Figaro is following her lead, letting her melody rule the number, this is a sort of microcosm for the entire opera. This is what's going to happen throughout the opera. Now, that's how Figaro starts. Don Giovanni, the next opera that I'm going to talk about, is a slightly different and darker piece. And it's about Don Juan, who goes to the opera murdering people, occasionally we think raping people, although this can't be really shown on the 18th century stage, so it's implied, and seducing a lot of women. And of course, his backstory as Don Juan means that this sort of seduction did not only start when the opera starts, it was going on for his whole life, and the opera simply shows us one 24-hour slice of his life, a day in the life of Don Juan. And of course, it's also the last day in the life of Don Juan because he famously is dragged to hell at the end of the opera. The scene that I've chosen from this opera happens relatively early on in the opera. It happens midway through Act 1. So we have yet to see the demise of the Don, and we have not seen anywhere near the extent of the womanizing. Act 2, quite a lot happens there also. But in this scene, what's happened is that Don Giovanni has happened upon a peasant wedding, a lady named Zerlina is going to get married to a guy named Mazzetto. And Don Giovanni has decided that Zerlina is rather pretty. He doesn't like the idea that she's going to marry someone else, so he decides to seduce her on her wedding day. And he finds a way to get his servant to take Mazzetto away. Mazzetto is out of the picture, and Don Giovanni has cornered Zerlina and is working his magic on her. And after a very long dialogue where he tells her about all the wonderful things that will happen in her life if she goes with him, he talks about all the ways he'll make her happy. He talks about how beautiful she is. He really does know how to sweet talk her. And as I say, it's a very long bit of dialogue. And after that dialogue, they sing a love duet together. And this love duet shows us a much more complicated way that music and words can interact in these operas. And this is where things get really interesting. You know, it's one thing where the music is agreeing with the text, like we saw in Figaro, but the other numbers that I'm going to talk about today, this one and the next ones I'm going to talk about, all show the music doing something quite a bit more complicated, not just agreeing with the text, but in some ways subtly moving against it and giving us a kind of psychological backdrop against which to understand the text. So in this number, things go a bit differently. Let's just quickly take a look at the text. Don Giovanni starts by saying, at his house, he's pointing off in the distance, at his house we'll join hands. You will tell me yes. Look, it's not far. Let's go there right away, my dear. And Zerlina replies, I want to and I don't want to. My heart trembles a bit. It's true that I would be happy, but he might be lying to me. So she, in the text, claims to be undecided. The music might tell a slightly different story. Here is the opening of this duet. I'm not going to play the whole thing now. I'm just going to start from the beginning and talk as we go. So here's the opening. You can follow the text. I'm going to stop it there. So if you noticed, the text makes it look like Zerlina is undecided. She wants to, she doesn't want to. What should she do? He might be tricking her. She's a bit nervous. Her heart is trembling. But the music tells a different story. She takes his melody. He sings something to her, and it's so captivating, she has no choice but to repeat it back to him. The text says she is undecided, but the music says she's not at all undecided. He has her from the time he starts to sing. Here it is one more time, just to get that in your heads. Here's his melody. And her response, I'm just skipping a bit, but her response, same melody, is... etc. So she sings his melody. Now, what would you do if you were a great seducer and you sang a melody to a girl who then repeated the melody back to you and seemed to suggest that she was willing to follow you? You would turn up the heat a bit. So what Don Giovanni says next, come my dear beauty, in the text it doesn't look like much, but even just in the text, something to notice is that he's no longer speaking in stanzas, right? At the opening of the duet, he sings a whole stanza. It's very decorous. It's what you do in the 18th century when you're a polite lover who's trying to woo somebody. You don't just say one line to them, you give them 4 lines, preferably with some rhymes, and they respond with 4 lines, also with some rhymes. Now he turns it up a bit and he just says one line, come my dear beauty, vieni mio bel diletto. And she responds, I'm sorry for Mazzetto. What does this mean? Maybe he turned up the heat a little bit too fast, a bit too much. She's now backing away and saying she's thinking about her husband again. Let's hear what Mozart does in the music. There's something very important that happens in the harmonies at this point. Now, if I play the beginning of the duet for you, you'll notice that the general change of sound of the harmonies happens once per bar, as we say in the musical world. I will do a little signal every time the harmony changes, and hopefully you'll be able to hear the rate of change of harmony. Here we go. 1 chord, new chord, new chord, new chord, new chord, new chord. In other words, it's happening roughly at a rate of once per second, or maybe a little bit less than once per second, but it's a quite steady rate. Now, when Don Giovanni says this next line, Vieni mio bel diletto, when he says, come my dear beauty, he doubles the speed at which the harmonies change. In this one line, come my dear beauty, he goes through 3 different chords. Sorry, let's just finish Zerlina's line. We'll just let her wrap up. Still slowed harmonic rates. And now doubled. Here we go. Chord, new chord, new chord. He's literally doubled it. Here it is one more time without my talking over it. Compare that to the beginning one more time. Here's his opening again. 1 chord every little more than a second. Compared to where we just were. Okay. Now her response, I'm sorry for Mazzetto, she sings just a single chord for that entire line. Again, putting on the brakes after he's just tried to accelerate them. So we now have Mozart giving us this little push and pull with them. At first, he was very polite, gives us a whole stanza. She's very polite, says a whole stanza also, but we know what she's thinking. She takes his melody. We know that she wants him. Then Don Giovanni tries to turn up the heat, 3 chords in 1 line, faster motion, no longer singing whole stanzas, and Zerlina says, no, it's too much. Don Giovanni then repeats. We have another line from him. I'll change your life. And again, it's the fast harmonic motion, more chords per bar. And then the opening lines repeat. Now, Zerlina has just said she's not going to be able to resist for much longer. And Mozart does something here to demonstrate her lack of resistance. Let's compare to the opening lines. The opening lines, you remember, they speak in stanzas. Now, Mozart has changed some things when the opening repeats at this point. I'm going to play this section and then see if you can think about what has changed, what's different here than the opening. Here we go. Any thoughts about what's different? There are a few things that have changed. Maybe the most obvious one is that they're now finishing each other's sentences. They're now not just singing 1 stanza at a time. Mozart has interlaced them. So Don Giovanni says 1 line, Zerlina says another line, Don Giovanni says another line, Zerlina says another line. Together they sing a full stanza. They sing 4 lines together, but it's no longer one of them at a time. They've now been mixed. Something else happens with the orchestration too. This is a wonderful little detail. When the melody is first presented at the very beginning, you'll notice that it's Don Giovanni alone with a very, very quiet accompaniment in the strings. Here it is, the very beginning, one more time. It's just him and some strings. Same thing with Zerlina's response. It's Zerlina with strings below. But what happens when this repeats after she says she can't hold out much longer? Mozart interweaves the lines and he does something else. He adds a wind instrument, playing the melody with them in the accompaniment. So here's the return of the melody. And here we are. Now, what does this actually mean? We have Don Giovanni singing his line, "There we'll join hands," and a flute is playing very high, the same melody with him. Hear it? When Zerlina responds, now she's the high voice singing, and there's a bassoon playing with her, very low. So Mozart has not only mixed them together in a single stanza by having them alternate lines, he's also mixed them in terms of their voices by having Don Giovanni sing not alone, but with a high feminine voice, singing the same melody at the same time. And meanwhile, Zerlina, when she responds, sings with a low masculine voice. Now, 18th century decorum dictates that you can't actually show people having sex on stage in an opera. But I think that Mozart is doing everything in his power to show us the mingling of these two people, that we have the mingling of the lines in the stanza, and then we also have the mingling of the sounds of their voices. The low voice man with the high flute playing with him, the higher voice woman with the low voice, the low sounding bassoon. One more time and then I'll continue. Now we get to the last little bit of the number, and we have these next lines, andiamo, let's go, let's go. And this is finally the moment when Zerlina actually comes out and says, yes, let's go, right? Don Giovanni says, let's go, and Zerlina now is finally agreeing with him. And this is not even just a matter of agreeing. She seems even more excited in some ways than he is. So what's gonna happen here is that Don Giovanni will say, let's go, let's go. He says it twice. Zerlina says it a third time, but the pattern that Mozart creates, Don Giovanni says it the first time on one note, the next time one note higher, and then Zerlina, when she says let's go, sings it on what would be the next note higher if Don Giovanni kept singing. So we have Don Giovanni singing one note the first time higher, and then Zerlina does it even higher, not only because her voice is higher, but because she's picked the next note up. So she's not only now agreeing with Don Giovanni, she's anticipating the next step in the seduction, and she's asking for it. Here we go, these are the let's go. Higher, and then higher. And now they sing together this little closing number, which again, the music is doing quite a bit of work. They're saying, the text says, let's go, and have an innocent love together. Now we, the audience, we know that this is not an innocent love. We know that she's married, and we know that Don Giovanni, being Don Giovanni, is going to dump her about an hour later, probably. And so the music comments on this in a way that suggests that even though the text is saying this will be a nice, innocent love, the music knows better. It's that thing that just happened. All is fine in the music while they're singing together, and as soon as the voices stop, we get this very weird chromatic accompaniment in the strings. All fine, and then, here it is. All is not well. We know that as soon as we hear the music doing this. Now, we're not actually going to finish this duet because in the opera, it doesn't really finish properly because it turns out that Don Giovanni's wife, whom he married a few, we think, days earlier and then abandoned, comes, finds him, tracks him down, and interrupts the seduction of Zerlina. So the duet doesn't really end properly, but you've gotten a taste of how music in this case can actually contradict what the text seems to be saying. The text is giving a very straightforward picture of somebody who doesn't know that she wants this, who keeps saying, I want to and I don't want to, I'm trembling, I pity for Mazzetto, and she doesn't change that text for the entirety of the duet until this very last bit. And yet the music shows her becoming increasingly excited. First, when she just takes his melody, then when they have the added instruments and they sing that stanza interlaced together. Even though the text is static and simply repeating, the music is giving us a kind of psychological story of what's going on in the background for them. Now, we're going to go now to a much more complicated music-text relationship. And this is, again, where things are going to get even weirder and cooler. The story here, at this point of the opera, this happens a few scenes later. All you need to know is that Donna Elvira is the apparent wife of Don Giovanni. Apparently, in the past, he promised to marry her as a way to get her into bed. She then woke up the next morning and he was gone. So she thinks that she's his wife, and meanwhile, he's off seducing more women. And as I say, she tracks him down, and she tries to tell the world what has happened and make sure that everybody knows how bad a man he is. And so Don Giovanni, at this point of the opera, is having a discussion with two other noblemen, Donna Anna and Don Ottavio. And the backstory here is that Donna Anna is searching for the person who tried to rape her that morning at midnight and then killed her father. And of course, Don Giovanni is that person, but he was wearing a mask, and so she doesn't know it's him. And she's asking for Don Giovanni's help in finding the scoundrel who destroyed her life. And Don Ottavio is her fiancé, and he also wants revenge. And Don Giovanni is trying to keep his enemies close. And so he pretends that he's going to help them. And meanwhile, Elvira stumbles onto the scene. This is the ex-wife, or the wife, and advises them not to believe what Don Giovanni will tell them. She says that Don Giovanni will lie to them. As she says, don't believe, unhappy one, in that faithless heart. The villain has already betrayed me, and now he seeks to betray you. Now, what we know about this text comes from the next stanza, the way Donna Anna and Ottavio respond. They say, wow, how noble she is, how majestic she is. Her tears, her pallor, fill us with pity. So we know that this text from Elvira has to be delivered in a very graceful and noble way. And indeed, Mozart writes some extraordinarily beautiful music. This is Elvira's melody, one of the most gorgeous melodies in the opera. She's obviously angry, and yet the music is so beautiful. And something very interesting happens at the end of this melody. She sings a little gesture at the end. It's the last thing she says on this very last line. We just heard her say it. It's that melody, which is a very classic ending melody. That's a very polite way to end a phrase. Yum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. That's how any number of melodies can end in Mozart's style. But something very interesting happens, which is that this little ending bit, even though in some sense it's the least interesting part of the melody, like she just sang that lovely, gorgeous, flowing, soaring melody, this is maybe the least interesting part, and yet Mozart repeats it in the wind instruments. As soon as she says it, the strings do it, then the flutes do it, the clarinets do it. It echoes throughout the orchestra. See if you can listen to this without listening to the singing at all. I'm going to play her last line. See if you can ignore the singing that happens after that and just listen to that melody. Yum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Get echoed throughout the orchestra. Clarinets, flute. Now, what Mozart is doing there is, I think, sort of equivalent to what a good film director can do with zooming. That when you are focusing in on a particular person or dialogue and the camera moves in to get a close shot of them, and we, the audience, are brought to look at them more closely and to think differently about what they're saying, rather than in the long shots that we might see that are more neutral. Mozart is giving us a way to focus on what Elvira has said. We are listening to the end of this melody in the same way that these other two characters are as they respond to it. And even though they're singing a different melody, the fact that yum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum is echoing through the music suggests that there's a kind of point of view, there's a listening here, and that we as listeners, as I say, it's sort of like in a movie, when the camera is showing you what to look at, this is the way that Mozart's music is telling us how to listen to what Elvira has said. Here's the opening again with her lines, and then we'll go on and listen to what Anna and Ottavio say about her. Even to end their little bit with her melody again. Yum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Here it is. Now, they are, those three characters, in the same little musical world right now. Elvira has said something and we have zoomed into that and watched Anna and Ottavio respond to it. Don Giovanni, of course, wants to get rid of Elvira as fast as he can. The poor girl is mad. Don't listen to her. Leave me alone with her. And the way he responds has nothing to do with what we just heard.
La povera ragazza è pazza, amici miei, è pazza, amici miei. Lasciatemi con lei, forse si calmerà, forse si calmerà.
And you'll see that even though he tries to inhabit that little world, you hear the orchestra play that same tag at the end. Yum, bum, ba-dum, ba-bum. Don Giovanni is never actually himself doing it in the same way that Elvira, Anna, and Ottavio did. He's trying to get at it. He's trying to live in that world, and he's failing a bit. And at the moment, it's 3 against 1. It's those three, Elvira, Anna, and Ottavio, against Don Giovanni. Now, that's going to change because Elvira loses herself a bit. Don Giovanni says that she's mad, and unfortunately, she's about to prove him a little bit right. She loses control, and as she says, "Do not believe the faithless one, stay for heaven's sake," you're going to hear that her music becomes increasingly strange. She starts singing faster, she starts singing higher, she can't quite keep a hold of her emotions. That's all Elvira, all that shrieking fast stuff, that's Elvira saying, "Don't believe him, don't believe him." And even that bit, as they're saying, I don't understand, this feeling is stirring within my breast, there are a million things I cannot yet grasp. And you hear the music become a bit confused. It's moved into a minor key, it's quite dark at this point, and they're all singing the same kind of melody, staggered, a bit like a round. Again, it's people wondering who to believe, what to think, going around in circles a bit, and Elvira is still going to keep shrieking at them. It's a little bit hard to capture for a modern day audience just how inappropriate those shrieks are in a number like this. Like, we started very politely listening to each other's melodies, picking up on them, responding to them, and all of a sudden she's really lost it. And she's singing music that has very little to do with the actual surroundings or the musical world that the other characters are inhabiting. She's not participating in the same kind of world that they are, in the same kind of social setup. And again, this would be extremely inappropriate to 18th century listeners to hear somebody losing it to this extent. Now she's going to go on, and Don Ottavio, I think we're ready to switch. He will be the first to say, "I'm not going to leave here until I find out what's really going on." Now, again, it's very interesting what Mozart's doing with the structure, because what's happened here is that we went from having characters speaking together, right? Elvira, Anna, and Ottavio together thinking something, Don Giovanni being the odd man out. Now we have 4 people all estranged from each other, all musically separate. We have Ottavio taking one stand that he's going to find out what's right, and he's going to stay until then. We have Donna Anna saying, "I feel a bit of sympathy for her. I'm also a wronged woman. I've just been forced, and then my father's been killed. She doesn't seem mad to me. What she's saying might be reasonable." We have Giovanni saying, "I'd really like to get out of here, but if I leave, they're going to suspect that I'm doing something wrong." And Elvira standing firm and saying they should be able to see written on his face how bad a guy he is. So Mozart has taken these characters who were working together musically, and he's now separating them out, not letting them work together as well. But things go on, and we're going to get another public moment where Ottavio and Giovanni start to discuss Elvira. Ottavio says, "So she must be," and Don Giovanni says, "Yeah, that's right, she's mad." And Donna Anna to Elvira says, "So you're saying that he," and Elvira says, "Yes, he is a lying betrayer."
Dunque quella pazzarella, La gente si radunò noi d'intorno, se aggiungono più prudenti vi farete criticare.
And even there, now you hear Don Giovanni losing it a bit, right? Now he's getting quite stressed out. He's talking faster. He's saying, be quiet, or you'll start to gather people around and we're going to be talked about. Let's listen to his line again. It's a rare loss of self-control for him. Usually his character is quite smooth and cool throughout this opera.
Zitto che la gente si radunò noi d'intorno, se aggiungono più prudenti vi farete criticare.
Speravo scena! Ho creduto alla credenza! Che colpa del mio stato! Voglio tutte palesar! Voglio tutte palesar!
And now, my favorite bit of this quartet happens now, where Mozart superimposes everything that's just happened. We have in Donna Anna and Ottavio a return to bits of the beginning material, and yet while they're talking, they're saying to themselves those whispered undertones, the blushing, they banish all my doubts. While they're talking, Elvira and Don Giovanni keep arguing. So we get this magnificent layering where you have on one hand the two noble characters, Anna and Ottavio, saying, yes, okay, we know what's going on here. And meanwhile, Giovanni and Elvira are like a bickering couple, still talking fast over what's going on beneath them. I'm just going to back it up another moment to get into that. Here we are. Sorry. And that's the end of the number. Mozart has given us a rather extraordinary journey from taking this poor woman very seriously and having other characters take her seriously, to this turmoil in the middle where all the characters are estranged from each other, to this bickering couple while Anna and Ottavio think they know what's going on. And it ends just by fading out like that, where the bickering lasts. And we get the sense that there's no real resolution, that Anna and Ottavio now suspect something is up. And Don Giovanni and Elvira are fighting, and we don't know what's going to become of any of them. And this propels the plot forward for the rest of the act. It's a remarkable number where Mozart, this whole number is 3 minutes long. In just 3 minutes of music, he gives us this strange psychological portrait of doubt, of fear, of arguing, and he carries us really from one mental state to a very different one by the end. Now, I only have one more musical number to play for you, and this one is very, very short. This is from the last of the collaborations between Mozart and Da Ponte. It's from Così fan tutte, and this is the most complicated and weird plot of all of these operas, so I'm not even going to try to give you a real overview of it, but all you need to know is that basically the two men, Ferrando and Guglielmo, are dating two sisters, Fiordilici and Dorabella, and they have decided that they want to test the faithfulness of the two sisters by pretending to go to battle. They've staged a bit of a war in the next town over, and they're making a big show of saying goodbye to the two sisters. And they know that after they say goodbye, they're going to sneak away as though they're going to battle. They're then going to get into very elaborate costumes. In the opera, they dress like Albanians. And they then come back and each one tries to seduce the other one's partner. And so the backstory here is that in this number, this is the farewell. They're just making a big show of leaving now. And in this number, Ferrando and Guglielmo, they know that this is just a trick. They know that they're not going to battle. They know that this is fake. But Fiordilici and Dorabella do not. They really think that they're saying goodbye to their lovers and that they are going to war. And this is set in 18th century Italy, where there actually were battles happening and where it was a reasonable thing to think that your lover might go to war and never come back. So this is a serious thing for the two women who actually think they might never see their love again. But for the two men, they're playing this elaborate and extremely cruel trick on the women, again, just to test their fidelity. And meanwhile, the only other character you need to know about, Don Alfonso, who says only one line in this number. He says, "I'll burst if I don't laugh," as he's watching this scene. All you need to know is that he is this old cynical philosopher who is the guy who put Ferrando and Guglielmo up to it. Don Alfonso, said at the beginning of the opera that there's no such thing as faithful love. Ferrando and Guglielmo said, "We will bet you that there is because our lovers are faithful." And Don Alfonso said, "Oh yeah, pretend that you're going away and see how long that lasts." So that's the backstory here, that Don Alfonso has put them up to this elaborate prank on their lovers, and they're now making a big show of going away. Now, this is an extremely funny number at first. You'll hear a very sincere "embrace me and my heart is breaking" to start it off, but then things get pretty comical.
Abbracciami, dormi.
Now, nothing is funny yet, but it's about to be funny. What Mozart does to make it funny, you'll see that in the Italian text here, write to me every day, di scrivermi ogni giorno. These are big multi-syllable words, right? Especially scrivermi. 3 syllables. Giuriami, swear. Again, multiple syllables. And Mozart sets the music because, of course, the women are sobbing so much. He sets the music in individual little bursts of sob. So even in these long words, they say just 1 syllable at a time because they're so choked up they can't even get the word out. And it's funny because the words are so long and then the musical burst is so short. It's a bit ridiculous, right? So the women are sobbing for real. The men are pretending to sob and they're doing a pretty good job. They're talking like the women, 1 syllable at a time. And meanwhile, behind it all, this is very interesting. The accompaniment, we have 2 layers to this accompaniment. One of them is this constant bum, 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 this little throbbing in the violins. You can hear it most clearly before the singing really starts. You can hear that. That just keeps going for the entire number. It never stops. Then beneath that, we have something in the bass. The bass instruments are just plucking individual notes, and they're plucking the same notes over and over again. Yum, bum, bum, bum. It's a normal, what we call a cadence figure. Literally the same notes every bar. Listen to the bottom and you can hear them. And it does not stop. This plucking and the bum, 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 it goes on for the entire number. Now, interesting moment first comes when Don Alfonso says, "I will burst if I don't laugh." And when he says that, he's a very, very low voice. When he says it in unison with the plucking basses. So he comes in and he's doubling the basses as he says that. He is singing the bass line as he says, "I'll burst if I don't laugh." Here we go. Now, what's significant about that is that this whole beautiful thing that's about to unfold is built on this really silly, simple bass line. And significantly, it's Don Alfonso who's saying the bass line. He, being the architect of this entire deception, this entire ruse that they're going away and saying goodbye and all that, this is all Don Alfonso's elaborate plan. And it's fitting that he should be singing this simple bass line, that he's the architect of it, he's the one supporting the whole thing, he's the one singing the bass, literally, in the plot and in this number. But what's interesting is what's about to happen, which is that as the text becomes a little more flowery, we have "Be true to me alone," "Keep faithful," and then "Farewell, farewell, my heart is breaking." The music becomes quite beautiful. We go very quickly from this funny little short sobbing bursts to some of the most glorious music Mozart wrote. The accompaniment is still doing the little throbbing, by the way. And now it becomes really gorgeous, and they all start singing together. And then Don Alfonso comes back in for the ending of the number. And that's it. And what's strange about this opera in general is that the music always seems to be most beautiful when the lying becomes most tragic and horrible. That as the deception becomes more disturbing, the music becomes more beautiful. And whenever the lovers are actually telling the truth to each other, the music is relatively simple and somewhat boring. There seems to be a certain irony here that every time we think the situation is becoming worse, Mozart turns up the beauty a little bit. And this is a perfect example. They're singing, when the four of them are singing together in the middle there, it almost sounds like it could be a hymn. It's four-part harmony. It's the sort of thing that you hear in almost religious contexts. And there's something about that particular setting that seems to be so sincere, as if even the men, the ones who are doing the deceiving, have sort of lost track of the fact that they're playing this elaborate prank on the women, and they seem to themselves get caught up in the real emotion that the women are showing. And of course, the entire time, Don Alfonso is there on the side, laughing at what they're doing. And the fact that Mozart brings him back at the end, singing that silly, simple bass line again, which again, has not changed. Like, it's exactly what you heard at the beginning. The fact that he brings him back, and just as we even in the audience are most caught up by this beauty, points to the simple, deceptively complicated structure going on beneath it. That silly little 1-5-1 gesture that Alfonso is singing. Mozart points our ears to that just when we also as listeners are getting caught up by the extraordinary beauty. There seems to be this elaborate prank going on, in other words, on the level of the music itself. That it's not only that the characters are getting caught up in the beauty, we the listeners are, and having Alfonso just remind us that he's there trying not to laugh, and again, significantly while singing that silly, simple bass line, is just a reminder of that disparity between the reality of the situation, which is that people are lying to each other and being quite terrible, and this little fantasy world that they have developed for themselves on the stage, where they're all in love and happy and sad that they're going off to war. So those are the four scenes I wanted to talk about. And as I promised, we started out with quite close relationship between the music and the text. And we ended up seeing music that could, I'm turning off the sharing, we ended up seeing music that could actually not only comment on the text, having Zerlina say one thing but maybe mean something else, but music that could actually so problematize the text that we actually doubt whether the text means anything really, or whether the whole psychological import is coming from the music. Now, I promised when we advertised this, I promised to tie this in a bit to some ideas that we might have outside of music, the way we might think about explanations and reality. And I'll do this briefly, and then we can open this up for discussion as promised. I guess the place to start is to ask what it would mean. Sorry, let me say this differently. There are two ways we can think about explanation in this context, at least two ways, maybe more. One of them, the first one, and I'll get to the next one in a bit. The first one is that we can ask what it would mean to explain how a piece like this comes into existence. And this is actually a place where picking the correct level of emergence and reduction really matters. Knowing exactly how you should be explaining something like this, because you could give an answer like, well, Mozart put some black dots on a piece of paper. And that would be in some trivial sense correct. But actually, even in serious musicological circles today, people try to explain the emergence of pieces like this in any number of ways that have little obvious connection to the music itself. So some people want to explain the existence of a piece like this in terms of the fact that money was concentrated in the court of Emperor Joseph II, and that money was paid for supporting opera productions, and Mozart was hired to write these operas. And that is indeed one way that this piece came into existence, but it doesn't really answer the important question about how this music came into existence, how one note got chosen instead of another. So there's a certain question about how reductive and how emergent we should be when we think about these issues. That we can talk about money, we can talk about social circumstances and politics, and all kinds of situations that had to be in place for works like this to get written, but at the same time, that doesn't really answer the question of how this piece gets written. Now, one way that we can try to answer it is in terms of the musical vocabulary in which Mozart's writing, that there are certain rules about how you write melodies and chords and harmonies, and the fact that after some chords you must or must not write other chords in this style. There were, in other words, quite a lot of stylistic constraints within which Mozart was working. And this is not unlike what we face in language, for example, when you want to put a sentence together. Having said a few words, there are certain other words that are grammatically correct or not correct to say. Certain tenses you can and cannot write in, certain points of view, certain cases. So this is in some sense what a poet would encounter also. That when Shakespeare has written, "Shall I compare thee to," and we have a preposition there, and then there's a space after that, we know that he's not going to just put a verb after that space, right? There are certain constraints. If you're speaking in the English language at a certain time, there are certain things you can and can't say. And of course, over time, those change. A 20th century poet can be much freer with punctuation and spelling, and even with the grammar in some sense. Some E.E. Cummings doesn't seem to adhere to any grammatical rules, and yet still manages to be poetry. Anyway, so you could make an argument on purely musical grounds that there are certain chords that are right to put after other chords and all that. But in fact, in the scenes that I've been showing you, one of the things that's interesting about these scenes is precisely that any good explanation of how they came to be has to also refer to abstract issues such as the reality of characters' minds, right? These characters are not just a bunch of words on a page. They're also people who have desires and who are lying to each other, or who are agreeing with each other, or who are disagreeing, or who want one thing or maybe another thing and are undecided. And that in fact, if we want to explain how a piece of music like any of these operas comes into existence, it may be that the most important thing to think about is the reality of what's going on in these characters' heads. Even talking about just the notes is insufficient, because it's that reality of what's going on in the characters' heads that is structuring how Mozart chooses the notes. Of course, he's still, empiricism, as I'm constantly saying, empiricism is false, and that also means that there isn't an easy way to just translate from characters' emotions to musical notes. You need a rather robust theory of what the notes mean and how they work and what the language means and all that. But the point is that Mozart has to start with some sense of who this character actually is, what they really want. When he sets Zerlina's melody as taking Don Giovanni's, despite the fact that her text says, "I don't necessarily know that I want to," he's doing so because he has a real theory of what is going on in her head. He's treating her like a real person. I think that in general, in aesthetics, and when we're dealing with art more generally, people hesitate to say that characters are real people. People seem to want a division between fiction and just things that actually happen in reality. And we even saw this, for those of you who saw the talk that I gave a bit over a month ago about Collingwood and Popper. I was talking about history a bit, and even Collingwood says in that book on history that this idea that you can just conjecture stuff and come up with explanations and apply them to history, this idea is dangerously close to writing novels, that you might as well be doing fiction, and what separates that from the truth. So I think people have some hesitance to actually say, well, these characters are real people. But I think what I'm actually trying to suggest is that they really are, in some sense, real people, and that if Mozart didn't have an extremely precise model of what's going on in their heads, he wouldn't be able to write these operas. That in fact, these people feature causally in the chain that leads from text to finished opera, to the music being written. And I think the same is true more broadly, aside from just what's going on in these operas, to ways that we can think about the causal effects that certain fictional characters have in the world. When we watch a Sherlock Holmes movie and say that some actor doesn't really look like Holmes to us, we are actually ourselves saying that we have a robust theory of who Holmes is, even though we only know him from a bunch of words on a page, and saying that some actor does or does not adhere to what that particular theory entails for the fact of how Holmes acts and looks and behaves and all that. So I think that it's actually, even though it seems counterintuitive in some sense, I think it's actually quite a defensible idea that these characters have to be real in the sense of the various criteria that we might adopt for reality, that they feature in our best explanation of how something comes about, that they exert some causal influence on the physical world. So that's one way that we might connect these ideas up. And I think actually this has some potential to clear up some bigger questions in aesthetics. There's a problem called the problem of fiction, or the paradox of fiction, the paradox of fiction in aesthetic theories that tries to figure out why is it that we can be very moved by works of art but not actually believe that they're really happening. That, for example, the example that's always used is that in a theater, when you're watching Othello, everybody is moved by it and maybe in tears by the end, and yet nobody storms the stage to rescue Desdemona before she is smothered. Because on one hand, they don't really think she's being smothered, but on the other hand, if they don't really think that, what could explain the intense emotional reaction they have? And I think that actually that question is often, it seems unsolvable because it's often put in terms of belief and disbelief and trying to explain that the audience simultaneously believes one thing while also not believing one thing. I think it's much simpler to say that in fact these characters are real, and that accounts for the immense power they have over us also as listeners and as audiences. So that's one way that explanation features in all of this. But I think another thing that it's worth just talking about for a moment, and then I'll stop, is this statement that I make constantly about how artworks are not explanations themselves. And I think that one of the things I'm trying to show with this way of looking at Mozart is that, in fact, the work of art is not something that shows itself obviously to be saying one or another thing. It's not a propositional statement. There's no scene that we just talked about, except maybe the first scene, maybe, if you're really skilled with this sort of translation. There's no scene that we just talked about that you could actually translate into some kind of propositional statement or claim that it's making, or that you could summarize easily. That's a really good test. Could you summarize a work of art? You can summarize a propositional statement. You can summarize many nonfiction books. You can summarize chapters and paragraphs of nonfiction texts. You can translate a theory from one language to another. But these numbers that we've just listened to, if you try to actually summarize the seduction number between Don Giovanni and Zerlina, you would be hard-pressed to do so. And this is true, I think, for all works of art. There's a wonderful book called Philosophy and the Film, written actually by a disciple of Popper, named Ian Jarvie. And this book tries to play this game with the movie Casablanca, where he gives a bunch of summaries from various film guides and points out that every one of the summaries falls short because there's some aspect of the film, not necessarily on the surface, but in its implication, that the summary fails to capture. And the same is true here, that it's not that the works of art just say something and we are listening to what they say. I've had to do quite a bit of interpretive detective work in these numbers to draw out the meaning that I have. And somebody who does a different kind of detective work might disagree with me completely. And we might have to criticize our theories and try to arrive at some better theory of how these works are operating. But ultimately, there isn't just something they're saying to us. I've said before that these artworks are very much like natural phenomena, that we are greeted by sunsets and waterfalls and a planet and sunrises, and we try to figure out how they work. And that this is actually not altogether so different from what we're doing when we try to understand a work of art, that in some sense, works of art and natural phenomena are in the same position, that we need, if we want to understand them, we need to build elaborate theories, make conjectures, criticize those conjectures, and thus try to improve our guesses about how things actually work. And this actually means, this is a wonderfully optimistic thing to say about the works of art, because it also means that there's no point at which we're done trying to understand them. There's no point at which we simply have the best explanation for what Don Giovanni is telling us, or what's really going on in those real characters' minds in Così. We are always looking for something better, and something better is always possible. I, as a musicologist, would find it very depressing if I had been told when I got interested in these operas that everything worth writing about them had been written 50 years ago, and that we simply know how they work. So I think it's quite a wonderful thing that artworks work in the same way that natural phenomena do, and that explanations are to be applied to them rather than to be identified with them. So I think I'll stop there. I don't know if that sheds some light on any of the points that I had made in the past, but I'll stop there and we can open up the discussion. I'll let Sam take over as moderator. And yes, thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for the talk. It was excellent. And also, thanks very much for the provocative statement. I think I agree with it. Let me just be, I'll ask the first question and then everyone else can ask theirs. So when you say that these characters are real, there's a sense in which I agree with you, but what you're not saying is that they're not exactly like us. I mean, they're not even recordings of real people, but there is some sense in which there's an abstract reality to who they are, and we can discover more about them. It still feels slightly paradoxical to say that they are real. You could say, well, they're still fictional. They don't inhabit the actual world. They never were real people, and they've just been made up in some sense. What would your response to that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a sense in which you're right, but I actually think that if you follow through the implications of what I've said, maybe instead of saying that this changes something about the status of the characters, we might instead say that this changes something about the way we think about people in the actual world. That, first of all, as I hinted at, when we're talking about history, even though Napoleon was real, and so were David Hume and Adam Smith and any number of other historical figures, I don't know why Hume and Smith just came to mind, but we are dealing with these people very much in the same way as we're dealing with these fictional characters, that when we want to understand what they were thinking, we try to posit something about their mental state maybe, or we try to figure out how they fit into causal events in the physical world that went on around them. In fact, what we experience as living humans is just, I think, a sliver of the ways in which we think about how people work. And in that sense also, I think that the characters in these operas are maybe a little bit more real than you are giving them credit for. That, as I say, I think if you follow the question the other way, instead of saying, how are the characters different from what we think of as real people, say, how are maybe real people different from how we normally intuitively think real people should be thought of? That may offer some way to look at it. I don't know if that addresses your question sufficiently.
Cool. Yeah, no, great, thanks. Okay, so we have various questions from the audience. I think it's very nice if people can just, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question in an orderly manner. I'll just point at one person to begin with, and then everyone else can follow. So Ernst has a question. Ernst, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful talk. So my question is also about the realness of the characters. So I guess the idea of, for instance, Don Giovanni has exerted influence on the way people lead their lives. So to explain some part of some behavior, you need to refer to Don Giovanni, and hence on the criteria that whatever appears in our best explanations, those things are real. But they're not real. I mean, they are not universal explainers. They're not real like they would be, I guess, in the same sense, like if you would create a computer world or simulate a universe where Don Giovanni would exist, you would create Don Giovanni in this world, and he's creative and can understand that he lives in this world. Then you would commit something immoral if you kill him or something. But if we stop thinking about Don Giovanni, I don't think there's a person that dies.
I mean, speak for yourself.
But,
okay. Okay, but I think, again, I mean, I take your point, and the same with Sam's point, but I think that, first of all, you're right to point out that they do exert a causal influence, not only in the music itself, but also on how we think and how we behave and all that. I don't know, I still am not sure that this is a damning criticism of the idea that they are real. I mean, one thing to say, for example, is that if we didn't ascribe some kind of existence to them outside of the bounds of the opera, then explaining the complex mental states they have in the opera would actually be more difficult. That we have to explain them in terms of quite a bit of unseen material that goes on outside of the opera as they are leading their existence in the rest of their lives. That it would be difficult to find a character as nuanced as a Susanna, as clever as a Susanna, as confused as a Zerlina, as angry as an Elvira, et cetera, if we didn't posit that they actually exist beyond the bounds of the opera also. And it seems that Mozart, like what Mozart is doing, is simply hitting upon, he probably has a general theory of these characters, and he is hitting upon a little sliver of them that makes its way into the music. But still, I think that we do have to take seriously the thought that they exist beyond the opera, and that's part of how we explain what we see them do in the opera.
Yes.
So following on from that directly, oh, sorry, did you have a follow-up question?
No, go on.
When you said like when it ceases to exist, I kind of thought of like, so there is this idea that are these characters, and if you entirely just like stop thinking about them, then like you would say, oh well, you know, they never existed and so they still don't exist. But it kind of, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of like getting rid of all books that have like a particular knowledge in it. It's kind of like it seems like there is an independent sort of thing there. And yeah. Sorry. Yeah. And then I suppose my question is, so Dorian, could the realness be something like there is a program running in our minds that is this character or represents this character or something, and by our thinking about this character, we are actually running the same types of computations that character would run if they were kind of a real thing.
I have no idea. I think that I'm probably not the person to answer that particular question. Like I'm hesitant to venture into talk about programs that we're running or computations that we're undergoing. It sounds vaguely reductionistic to me, and that computations, even if they are definitely happening in our minds, are not the level at which to think about how we're thinking about these characters. But as I say, I'm hesitant to go there. I don't think I haven't thought this through enough to have a response to that. But it's a very interesting thought.
And as a follow-up that's even more kind of like out there, so there's this concept called an egregore, and an egregore is like basically a piece of knowledge that that lots of people have, that by them having it sort of creates it. So things like Santa Claus or like, you know, characters, it's sort of, but that causes people to actually act differently given that knowledge. And so, you know, Santa Claus actually is real because there is a sense, like, you know, everyone is interacting with the world as if that is a real thing in the real world. So is that the same type of realness that you're referring to here, or a kind of different one?
I mean, I think that in some sense it's the same type, but I would point out that the realness of Santa Claus doesn't go anywhere near the realness of these characters. That the psychological nuance, I think really what I've been getting at is that there is a deep psychological nuance and reality to these characters' minds. And that I don't know, I mean, maybe I just haven't engaged with enough Christmas literature or films to know like what's going on in Santa's mind in various artworks. But I'm tempted to say that these characters are much more real than what I know of Santa Claus. That yes, he exerts a causal effect on the way people behave, but to say that these characters are not only shaping the way people behave in general and say causing hordes of people to sit in opera houses for 3 hours at a time, they're, aside from that, like they're also shaping the notes that Mozart's writing. They're shaping the movements of an artistic pen, and I think that that's a level of detail and sort of specific causation that is much harder to find in other non-art characters like Santa Claus and Adam and Eve and figures like that.
I think your point that our model of how these characters behave is very similar to how we think of each other or how we think of historical figures is very strong.
Yes, and especially how we think of each other. I didn't say that, but thank you for mentioning that. That's absolutely right. That I have models of, you know, the people I know in this room. I have models of their minds, and I have a sense of how they think and how they behave. And I think it's really not unlike my relationship with Susanna or Don Giovanni or Zerlina.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Liberty, I see your name on the list. And Carl.
Yes. You mentioned that, well, you suggested that there are people who disagree with your interpretations of these pieces. And I was just wondering if you have any examples of, like, is there anything where you think you like some aspect where you think people would disagree, and if so, why?
I mean, I think that in general, the idea that the music and text are diverging significantly from each other is something that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily take too seriously. That, for example, one might say that you could explain Zerlina's imitation of Don Giovanni's melody based entirely on the fact that in the 18th century, people imitate each other's melodies in operatic duets. And that a lot of other composers have that happen. It's not actually that remarkable. I would point out that in the Figaro duet we listened to, there's no melodic imitation at first. But I think basically I think my tendency, the thing that most people disagree with me about, I have a tendency to ascribe great significance to a lot of Mozart's decisions and also great uniqueness to Mozart as a composer, where I'm willing to say it doesn't matter that everybody else at the time was having operatic duets where characters sang the same melody, because when Mozart does it, it has to mean something. And I think that view is one that a lot of musicologists wouldn't agree with at this time. They would say that you have to understand things in their context, and that Mozart is working with conventions. And I would say that essentially he's not really. But anyway, that's one example.
Carl? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So my question is slightly unrelated, but I was wondering about your take on objective beauty, because it's a concept I've struggled with myself, because, you know, within science and philosophy, it's kind of easy for me to picture like an objective reality that we sort of try to approach using like explanatory theories. But what's your take on art and the connection to objective beauty? Like, do you believe in the concept?
I believe in objective value in art. I do think that some works of art are better than other works of art, and I think that that is an objective fact. I don't know that beauty is the right idea to be using here, and again, this is a subject of some debate with people in this room, and I'm sure that there would be other viewpoints if we open this up more widely. But in brief, I think that when we say things like, for example, the opposite of beauty is not ugliness, but boringness, I think that this statement is true. And I think that the fact that the statement is true suggests that beauty is not really the thing we're talking about in art. What we're talking about is interestingness. That interestingness is the actual opposite of boringness. And that interestingness is the thing we're really getting at when we think we're talking about beauty. That works of art don't keep us engaged or thinking or talking about them because they happen to be beautiful. They keep us engaged because they provoke and they're interesting and they present things that we need to unravel and understand, in the same way that a waterfall might be beautiful or a sunset might be beautiful, but ultimately the thing that keeps us talking about it and thinking about it is also how interesting it is. That the reason we do science at all is because the world is interesting, not just because it's attractive and pretty and we want to know a little more about it. So I do think that there's objective value in art. This is obviously nowhere near a long enough answer to really answer the question, but I don't think that in 4 minutes I can do justice to it. But I'll say that I do think there is objective value. I wouldn't see it in the same way as we see objective reality, where there's a thing that our scientific theories are approaching and tending towards. I don't think that there is a state of beautiful art that our artistic works are getting closer to. I think that works can be more and less interesting than other works, and that we can argue about that and we can disagree and we can, through criticism, come to converge a bit. And as I said,
so
interesting.
Just like a short follow-up then.
Sure.
So what's the method for distinguishing objectively better art from worse art? Is it just like criticism, discussion?
Yeah, it is. Argumentation and criticism, yeah, as with everything else. There's obviously a lot more to say about that. But yeah.
Cool, I see there's a point from Jonathan, although it's not technically a question, but Jonathan, if you want to share it with us, then go ahead, please.
I didn't know that Santa Claus was an elf. I thought that he was distinct from elves and that he employed elves.
That's what I thought too. Maybe it's a metaphor? No. Okay, I'm not hearing anything from Jonathan. Well, I can ask another question, which is, I think in the past we've had this discussion about whether art is, for example, whether music is an explanation. So we have the text of the opera, but we also have the songs or the music that accompanies it. And especially in your examples, you really clearly saw that a lot of what we think about the opera is actually embedded in the music itself, not just in the text. So you had this nice example where if you read the text literally, then it seemed like Susanna was disagreeing or was hesitant. Whereas if you listen to the music, then you could actually discern that she wasn't, that she was very willing to go along. And that seems to me like there is an explanation in the music as well. The music has an explanation in it, or that the music is an explanation of what's going on in the story. But I think you're reluctant to go along with that.
I'm very reluctant to go there. I mean, I think that, again, the music itself is not the explanation. Like, I was explaining the music a certain way, but I have colleagues who would explain it, as I just mentioned to Liberty, I have colleagues who would explain it entirely by saying, well, this is what the convention of the time dictates. In that case, the music isn't really giving us an explanation for why it works the way it does. I'm the one positing an explanation which may be better or worse than other explanations, but the music, it's not coming from the music. There are lots of ways we could explain any of this music.
Yes, but
I don't know if we're at cross purposes, but
yeah, I think that given a certain context, given a certain culture, people reliably interpret what the music means. And I mean, in a sense, you're reconstructing that context for us by explaining it to us.
I mean, I think it is worth saying that I don't think that, yes, it's true that in a certain culture, people reliably interpret music in similar ways, but that doesn't mean that the music is saying any of that. It could just be that they have certain mindsets that cause them to hear music in a particular way. Empiricism is false, and what you hear is not just about the music that's coming at your ears, but about the mindset with which you're listening to it. I would also point out that, or actually maybe that's all I need to point out. But yeah, I don't know. I'm still hesitant to say that the music is the thing that is actually giving us the meaning in any straightforward way. I think that there's quite a lot of critical work that's been done to try to unravel what the meaning might be. I'll also point out that I'm not listening to this music in a historical way necessarily. Like, I've given you a little bit of historical information so that you can see some of what Mozart's doing, but in general, I'm trying to figure out what is the aesthetic fact of the matter in terms of how the music works, not what did an audience member in the 18th century think. Like, I would take the view that everybody in a certain culture might hear the music in a specific way, but they could all be wrong about what it actually means. And that actually was probably happening quite a lot with Mozart. Like, if I'm right that he's somewhat unique or very unique among composers of his age, it's likely that everybody who listened to him for the first few decades that his music was out there was listening to it incorrectly, or in a way that I would say is not really actually in a way that would get at the meaning of the music or do so in any depth.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes along nicely with your idea that the characters in the opera are real, because just as we can be confused about what's going on with the characters, the composer can be confused and the audience can be confused. So I think am I interpreting you right in thinking that? Yeah,
we could all be confused. We are all confused.
Yes.
So if it's possible to make a mistake, then there must be something like being right or being more right, which is the same thing as saying that the thing we're talking about is real.
Yes.
Very nice point. Yes. Further questions? Anyone else have another question for Dorian?
I see a follow-up from Carl and...
Yeah, it's not exactly a follow-up, but I noticed the examples you provided. It's like the music that provides like the deeper meaning, the deeper truth, reveals the inner mental states of the characters, or reveals where the plot is going, whereas like the actual speech, it can be kind of misleading. So is this recurrent, or is it ever the other way around, where the music is misleading and the text is the actual truth?
Well, I don't think that that's as simple as what I was saying, that the music is simply doing the work for us and the text is unimportant. I think that what we're seeing is a synthesis of music and text that's very interesting, that a different text, Mozart would write different music, that it's not simply that there's this musical reality happening and the text doesn't matter. So I think that there is actually a very close synthesis, and that paradoxically, the closeness of that synthesis comes from Mozart's departures from the text, because it means that we can have both surface text and subtext. That if the music were always simply doing what the text said, we'd get a very flat picture of those characters. And that it's precisely by this divergence that we can have the text saying one thing and the music saying something else. That's one of the things that gives it the richness, because we have now like multiple metrics in which we can understand what's going on in these characters' minds. So I would be hesitant to say that the music is simply doing all the work, because if you took out the text completely and just listened to the syllables, if I didn't give you those texts to look at, I doubt that the music would have meant as much or seemed as powerful or as much shedding light on the psychological reality of these characters as it did. So I don't think that I'm willing to make that distinction between music and text in this way.
Would it be fair to consider like the music the subtext of what is being said?
Even that, not necessarily so simple, because sometimes the text itself can be in reality a kind of subtext. I mean, what Mozart, I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily want to make such such strict divisions between these categories. I think in some cases, yes, and in some cases, maybe not.
Cool. Okay. We have a question from Carlos, which is, what's an example of the composer being mistaken?
Well, actually, we see that in Mozart quite a bit. One of the things that happened a lot in the 18th century was that composers would revive operas a few years later, because remember the days before Spotify, if you wanted to hear an opera again, you had to actually go see it performed. And so operas would get revived every few years if they were popular enough. And in the process of reviving them, because the composer was still alive, if there was a change of cast, the composer might be asked to write different music, in some cases to accommodate the voice of a different singer. So for example, one particular one with Mozart, he wrote Don Giovanni for a premiere in Prague, and there was an extremely skilled tenor singing Don Ottavio. When the production moved later on to Vienna, and it was revived, the tenor could not actually physically sing the aria that Mozart wrote for Ottavio, and he had to write a new one. And this happened with Figaro, that he rewrote a bunch of arias for that in a revival a few years later. He didn't have a chance to revive his later operas because he died too soon, but he did revive his operas quite a bit, and he revised significant portions of them. And what's interesting about this is that every change he made in these operas is considered to be worse than the original version. So it seems that he was right about something when he first composed them, and then for some reason, when he went to change them, he actually ended up making changes that were not improvements. Maybe the original versions were hard to vary, and even for Mozart a little too hard to vary or something, but he seems to have been wrong about some of the changes that he made. He replaced good arias with bad arias, or not bad arias because it's Mozart, but like much less good arias.
Interesting, I didn't know that.
Does that mean that the versions we know are the originals rather than the revivals?
In some case, usually the versions we know are hybrids that Mozart never imagined would be performed. And again, Don Giovanni is a good example, that usually audiences like to hear two arias from Ottavio. They like to hear the original virtuosic one and the slow replacement that he wrote. And people don't realize that actually to give Ottavio two arias in any one original production would have been too much for that character. Like, he's not important enough to get two arias. But today, we always hear both versions because people like both versions. So actually, normally what we hear today is a version that Mozart never imagined would be performed. We hear hybrids. It depends on the opera. Figaro, we usually listen to the original. Don Giovanni is a hybrid.
So another way in which he was wrong. You think that the performances of nowadays are better than
no, I mean, I think I personally don't find Ottavio to be a very interesting character, so I don't really need to hear two arias from him. So I think Mozart was probably right about that. That there's not enough substance there to warrant a whole other aria. But I mean, again, there are disagreements.
Yes. Okay, we have some more questions in the chat. Let's see. Okay, someone asks, wouldn't that apply to books as well? I.e., that we may be reading books incorrectly and that therefore books don't contain explanations.
I think that's part of a larger conversation that's going on in the chat. And the point is that that nothing can be said clearly enough that it's not misunderstood. This is something that was just entered into the chat a few moments ago. And this might apply to viewing works of art as explanations. One last thing I'll say about the art as explanation thing, and then I'll probably say goodbye because I've now been talking for more than an hour and a half.
Yes.
The last thing I'll say about the art as explanation thing is just that, again, a massive difference is that explanations can be translated. You can take an explanation about relativity or quantum mechanics and you can translate it from English to German and then to Chinese and into any number of different languages. With music, if you try to, and sorry, I should say that in that case, the explanation, the content is the same, even though the sounds that you make to express that content are very different, right? So the sounds, when you change a sentence from English to Chinese, there will be almost no overlap of sound, but the meaning will be the same in both cases, if you've translated it well. In music, if you change the sounds, you're changing the music. There isn't a separation of content and sound in the same way. This is why I say that works of art and pieces of music in particular are presentational patterns, that the arrangement of the sounds, or in a painting, the arrangement of brushstrokes, or in a novel or poem, the arrangement of words actually matters. That it's not as simple as there's a meaning and that's what the art is doing. It's also tied to the actual presentation. This is not true of explanations. Explanations can be translated, can be changed, can be shortened, can be summarized. You can't really summarize a poem, much less a film or an aria from an opera, much less the whole opera. So I'm hesitant to grant that works of art are explanations. I think that works of art can be explained. They definitely arise through explanations. It is only with explanations that you can make a work of art. I think of them very much in the same way that we think of products of engineering, that a spaceship is not an explanation, although you need explanations to make spaceships. But works of art are even more detailed than that, because the color of the paint on the spaceship presumably doesn't change how it flies, whereas the color of the paint on the canvas changes the painting, and likewise the sound of the music.
Great. I think, indeed, considering the time, we might make that a final question. And I would like everyone to join us in thanking Dorian once more for being here. I always love the reactions that Zoom gives us. Here you go.
Thank you so much again for having me. It's been really fun.
Yeah. Dorian is also on Twitter and he has a blog.
Yes.
I think it was in your slides. If you briefly want to pull them up again so people can see them, or otherwise you can see them on Facebook. Yeah,
here is my contact info and the recordings that I used for this presentation, they are here.
There we go. Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for coming. It was great. I really loved the talk, and maybe we'll see you at some future event.
Yes, I would be delighted to join.
Great. Okay. That being said, thanks everyone for being here, and we hope to see you at the next event. Bye-bye.